Hi everybody, in this video I'm going to be sharing some thoughts on practicing, how to practice, what to practice and how to put together an effective guitar practice routine. And this is probably going to be a little bit of a talky video, but I hope it's going to contain some useful information, perhaps for those of you who are struggling to know what to work on and those of you needing a bit of structure and direction for your practice. And I decided to make this video following on from my recent 30-day technique challenge. And off the back of that, I got quite a few questions about how to practice. People were wondering whether they should be playing technical exercises for hours on end every day, and the answer to that is probably you shouldn't be doing that. But what should you be practicing? What is the best thing to be working on? Obviously there's no one size fits all practice routine. It's going to depend on what level you're at, what kind of player you want to be, how much time you've got to practice, and also your temperament with regard to practicing. Some players don't mind playing technical exercises for 2 hours straight and they find it quite soothing and rewarding. For other players, that kind of thing is going to be totally unbearable. But there are, I think, some general principles that most people should follow when they're practicing, and I'm going to talk about those in the first part of this video. In the second part of this video, I'm going to get into 3 specific example practice routines. So I hope you're going to find this interesting. If there's anything you think I've missed out, or if you've got any favorite practice strategies of your own that you'd like to share, then do let me know in the comments. And before we get into the nitty-gritty of this video, I suppose it's worth asking yourself these kind of basic questions. And personally speaking, there have been times in my playing career when I've practiced a lot, several hours a day. There have been other times where I've done very little formal practice whatsoever. I've always been playing, whether it's been teaching or playing in bands, but there have been periods where I've not formally sat down and practiced. And whether you want to sit down and do formal practice sessions is going to depend on where you're currently at and where you want to go. And if you're a beginner, then clearly you're going to need to sit down and practice just to get your basic skills together that you need to sound decent. But beyond that, if you're at the stage where you're happy with your playing, you can play what you need to play, then maybe you don't need to practice, or you don't need to do that much practice. You can just maintain your skills and have some fun, and that's totally fine. Personally, I still enjoy learning new stuff. I like to feel as though I'm progressing and becoming a better player. That's what motivates me. So these days I do sit down and practice for half an hour or so every day, and that's on top of the time I'm spending making these videos and teaching and writing music, that kind of thing. I'm trying not to come across too much like one of these productivity or self-improvement YouTube channels, but I do think it can be useful to think about your goals and to sit down and think about the bigger picture. What kind of player do I see myself being a year from now, 5 years from now? Spend some time thinking about this stuff, maybe write this stuff down, because there are way too many things to potentially be practicing and working on. So you need to narrow down your options, and by thinking about your goals, it's going to lead you to the specific things that you need to be working on. Now, there's a time for sitting on the sofa with a beer or a cup of tea or a pint of Baileys and noodling about on the guitar, having a bit of fun. This is something that I do, not generally speaking with a pint of Baileys, but I sit down and noodle about. But you can't really describe that as practicing. And I think if you want to get better in as short a time as possible, then focused practice is where it's at. And that means setting aside some dedicated practice time, turning off your phone, being free from distractions, and just putting the work in. It pays to be organised with your practice, and I think it's a good general idea to divide up whatever practice time you've got into different areas. So say you've got half an hour to practice, you're going to be working on 3 or 4 different things, 3 or 4 different skills, and the specifics of this are going to vary and change over time, but it's a good general principle. I think I'm going to get into some specifics a bit later on in this video, but you want to be working on a good mixture of things. So maybe some exercises, working on new pieces, going over older pieces, maybe doing a bit of improvisation, and then generally I like to save the fun stuff to the end of the practice session as a kind of reward. So I'll reward myself by learning a fun new riff or just jamming over some backing track. And I would urge you to be quite disciplined with this and actually use a timer to set specific time frames for each activity. So you've got 5 minutes on an exercise, the timer goes off, then you move on to the next thing, and that way you're not cheating and you're spending more time on one thing whilst neglecting another thing. You're going to become the sum of all the things you practice and work on. And it's easy to forget this, I think, and to get sidetracked. And I've often found myself seduced by some new YouTube video where there's some amazing player and I go, oh my God, I've got to learn to do that. I've got to play like that. Only later to realise that I've actually been wasting my time and I don't actually want to play like this person. I should really be focusing on the kind of music that I want to be playing. So perhaps this is a slightly obvious point, but it's important to practice the kind of music that you want to play and not to get distracted by all the other irrelevant stuff. This is more of a practical one and things that are going to make it more likely that you put the time in and practice. And it could be as simple as just having a guitar out on a stand near where you practice rather than having it hidden away in a case somewhere. You're more likely to pick up the guitar if it's right there next to you. And things like having a nice dedicated practice space can be really helpful. I know not everyone's going to have the luxury of having a dedicated practice room, but if you can just carve out a little nook or corner of a room where you can practice, where you can be set up and just have everything ready to go, then it's going to make practice a lot easier. It's far more likely that you're actually going to do it. And just having your guitar and amp out and ready to go, and any other practice materials that you're likely to need. So perhaps a notebook, music stand, metronome, and any other gear you might need. Though don't get too distracted by gear. I find that's very distracting during practicing to have tons of pedals and to be messing about with all of that stuff. You should be practicing stuff you find pretty challenging, stuff you can't yet do. And this is hard because it means that a lot of the time when you're practicing, you're going to be sounding really bad. And this is quite humbling, quite bruising to the ego. It's far easier to sit down and blast through something you're really comfortable with. But that's not really very productive. But having said that, I think there is a sweet spot and you don't want to be working on stuff that's unreasonably difficult or totally unobtainable. You want a moderate challenge. So if you're in the beginning stages of learning jazz, you're not going to sit down and try and learn to improvise on giant steps at 400 beats per minute or whatever, or just get totally dispirited. I think it's a good idea to keep some kind of practice journal, and this is helpful in lots of ways. It's a really good way of staying on track, keeping track of your goals and measuring your progress. So you just need a notebook, and in that you can write down your practice routine, and then every day when you practice you can kind of tick things off. You can keep a record of what you're working on, and you can also include any other relevant information. So metronome speeds, if you're working on things in specific keys, you can make a note of that too. And it's a great way of staying organized and keeping everything on track. So yeah, I mean, in all seriousness, there are of course some great guitar YouTubers and great guitar videos out there, but very often they can be a bit of a distraction. And sometimes these videos actively make you feel inadequate, where there's some dude, usually is a dude, sort of showing off his chops and his knowledge, and without any sort of effort to impart any information. It just ends up making you feel kind of crappy about your own playing. And I think if you are going to be using videos in your practice routines, then make sure you're selective, make sure you choose them carefully, and that they are relevant videos rather than just the latest video that the algorithm spews out to you. Now, despite my 30 days of guitar exercises, I don't actually believe that you should be spending hours every day working on the spider exercise or whatever. Yes, exercises, drills have their place, but particularly if you've got limited practice time, I think the best thing you can be doing is to be working on playing actual pieces of music, because this is going to give you pretty much everything you need. By working on a piece of music, you're simultaneously going to be working on your rhythm, your technique, you'll be developing your ear, perhaps learning a bit about music theory, and on top of all of that, you're going to have fun learning a nice piece of music which you can then add to your repertoire and potentially play in front of other people. All right, I'm going to talk you through 3 example practice routine scenarios just so you can try and get a feel for how all of this stuff that I've been wittering on about actually works in practice. So let's begin and say you're a beginner acoustic player. You've not been playing very long, but your goals are to be able to play some of your favourite songs, perhaps one day performing them in front of friends or an audience, and maybe one day you might want to write some songs of your own as well. So what would your practice routine look like? And I think in this kind of situation, it's actually quite easy to put together a productive practice routine. There are some very clear skills that you need to be working on. So say you've got half an hour to play around with, I would divide that half hour up into 5 or 10 minute chunks. Maybe for the first 10 minutes you can be working on your chords and your chord changes. So as a beginner, you're going to want to be super familiar with your basic kind of cowboy chords, and you perhaps just spend some time just going between your chord shapes, just chord pair exercises between the most common chords, just working on your technique, making sure everything is nice and clear, you've got no buzzing notes, any of that kind of thing. Then for the next 10 minutes, maybe you would turn your attention to your strumming hand and work on some strumming patterns. So just some basic strumming. Working on keeping that nice and steady, perhaps using a metronome, perhaps introducing some chord changes with the strumming once you're comfortable with that. Then for the next 10 minutes, you're going to be working on actual music and learning some songs. So appropriate songs that are appropriate to the kind of level that you're at, that are using the kind of chords that you're working on, but importantly stuff that you're going to enjoy playing. So relevant songs, the kind of music that you want to listen to, the kind of music you want to end up playing. And then for the last 5 minutes, maybe something slightly different. Maybe you could work on some single note playing, some blues riffs or rock riffs, something along those lines. And put all of that together, I think you've got a nice rounded half-hour practice routine. So you can do that with the timer. So in 10 minutes on the first thing, the beeper goes off, and then 10 minutes on the next thing, and then you're practicing in a nice kind of organized and efficient way. Next scenario, let's say you're an intermediate jazz player, someone who's just starting to get a little bit more serious. And I think if you're into specific styles, then it's a little bit easier when it comes to practice routines. There's quite a clear learning path with something like jazz, and there are specific skills that you need to work on, specific tunes that you need to learn. So our imaginary jazz player, let's say they've got an hour's worth of time to play around with. I would use the same kind of format. So you're going to split that up into 10 or 15 minute chunks. Maybe the first 15 minutes you're going to be working on some kind of drills, so some kind of fretboard knowledge or technique thing. So it might be just playing arpeggio exercises, for example. It's a skill that's very relevant to jazz. Maybe you're working on some rhythm guitar stuff, perhaps playing through a tune using shell voicings or something like that. Then maybe you could spend 15 minutes transcribing some of your favourite players. This is an important thing, particularly when it comes to jazz, is learning from the greats. So putting on one of your favourite jazz solos and trying to figure out what's going on, and try and maybe steal some ideas or some licks from some of your favourite players. And it doesn't have to be guitar players either. It could be any of the great jazz sort of horn players or piano players. There's lots of stuff to be drawn from those classic jazz recordings. Next 15 minutes you might want to work on learning tunes. This is another big part of learning about jazz, is just getting a repertoire of those classic tunes, so you can just gradually work your way through all of those standards and jazz classics. And then for the final 15 minutes I'd recommend just doing some improvisation, so putting on some records or backing tracks and playing through some tunes, whether it's playing the melodies or chords or improvising some single note stuff. Okay, let's have a third imaginary guitar player. Maybe this person is an intermediate level player who's into kind of indie and alternative music, so kind of someone a bit like me basically. And the format of the practice routine can still be the same. You're going to divide your practice time up into these different sections, but make sure the things that you're working on are relevant to the kind of music you want to be playing. So you probably don't want to be working on jazz shell voicings or 3-note per string shred licks if you're an indie player. So in your first 15 minutes of practice time, yes, you might want to be working on technique or on fretboard knowledge, but make sure it's something relevant. So maybe you're working on some rhythm guitar skills, maybe some fast strummed 16th notes. that kind of thing with a metronome perhaps. Maybe you want to work on your triads. That's something that's always relevant to most styles, and it's got particular uses in kind of more atmospheric melodic music. So learning your triads, working on connecting triads, coming up with interesting parts based on those shapes. Next 15 minutes, I still think it's worth working on some tunes and some actual music. So if you're an indie player, you learn some tunes from your heroes. So you might want to learn a Johnny Marr tune or something that's quite challenging, something that's actually inspiring, and that maybe you can use elements of it in your own playing. Maybe you want to spend 15 minutes working on single note improvisation. Now, this isn't a big part of certain styles of indie music, but if you're in a kind of television type band, maybe you want to work on soloing in kind of a cool way over a Dorian mode chord progression. And then perhaps in the last 15 minutes, you might want to work on something a bit more creative. And I think this has got its place in certain types of practice routines. So maybe you actually want to write some riffs and some song parts that you can then take and use in the next rehearsal that you've got with your band or whatever it might be. So that's it. I hope you found it useful. I know it's been a little bit talky, but I hope there's been some interesting information in there. I did quite like doing these kind of videos occasionally rather than just always doing the kind of song tutorials or whatever. So thanks very much for watching. If you're not already subscribed to my channel, it would be appreciated if you would do that. You can also sign up to my Patreon page if you'd like to support this channel and help me to continue doing what I'm doing. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.